Hey folks, welcome to Narratives. Narratives is a podcast exploring the ways in which the world is better than in the past, the ways it is worse, and the paths towards a better, more definite vision of the future. I'm your host, Will Jarvis, and I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode. I hope you enjoy it. You can find show notes, transcripts, and videos at narrativespodcast.com. Well, Zohar, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Will. How are you?
Doing good. Thank you so much for taking the time to hop on today. I really appreciate it. Do you mind giving us a bio and some of the big ideas you're interested in?
The short bio is that I'm a rabbi, an independent scholar, and a poet. And a coach. I do all of this as a self-employed roving intellectual on the internet, teaching in person and over Zoom. And I'm passionate about art. I'm passionate about spirituality and faith and theology. I'm passionate about the history of ideas, and of course, how all of those very abstract and monumental issues touch the individual in this cultural moment, and how we personalize the great ideas by really bringing them back to the question of how should we live.
Got it. I'm curious. I want to zoom in, and I'm going to go off the outline, so I apologize. But you just said something that's really interesting. The individual. The world seems to have gotten very collective, in some sense, and less focused on the individual in the past, 50 years. At least to me, I have that feeling. I remember Peter Thiel has this line recently where he says there hasn't been a ticker tape parade for an individual since, the late 1990s. And even then it was a couple of athletes and people that were not necessarily even American and all these interesting, asterisks to put beside it. Do you have any sense as to why that is the case and why that has happened?
Well, before I accept the premise and give a hypothesis, I got to say just one quick word about the individual itself, right? The meaning of the word individual means not dividable. But from my understanding, the arrival of this term in the history of ideas really came to be with Hobbes, who in a sense invented the individual. He invented this idea of something that can't really be divided anymore, because he was trying to deal with the real problem in his time of civil war and the theoretical problem that without giving the individual some basic integrity, we're just going to kill each other. So I agree or disagree with Hobbes, but it's worth casting a long view on this question of the individual and just realizing that for most of human history, there hasn't been an individual in the way that we've constructed it. So it wouldn't surprise me if the individual is in decline. It may not have the same Lindy attributes that we should expect, let's say, from things like tribe or caste or what have you. As to is the individual in decline, I'm not quite sure about that. I think that if you sort of take a dialectical view, though, of history and culture, you'll see that there's always a backlash against whatever's culturally ascended in a generation earlier. So I can see the rise of individualism leading to atomization, leading to alienation, and then the question is, what's going to fill that gap? One hypothesis proposed by Baudrillard is that consumerism is going to fill that gap. Consumerism in the sense of you are what you buy, and now social media helps you really brand yourself and identify with brands and create a pseudo community around that. So is that that's a bit of a horseshoe, right? With the individual shopping at Urban Outfitters to express individualism and then broadcasting that out to thousands of other people who also share that same so-called individualist aesthetic. And then there's, I think there's New Age religion, and be it in the form of yoga, be it in the form of sort of the cult of masculinity on the new right. There's a great book by Tara Burden kind of on this called Strange Rights. She was on my podcast, Meditations with Zohar, recently. So I see it as in a sense, individualism and tribalism are in dialectical relationship with one another. They're not really opposites. Bad tribalism leads to individualism. Bad individualism leads back to tribalism.
Gotcha. So it's something like this kind of cycle through history where we cycle between these two things, and right now perhaps we're fairly atomized, or it feels like people are quite lonely, and then but perhaps we'll find some way back to community. Or in
it's interesting. The word loneliness. So Hannah Arendt, in many places, she identifies loneliness with fascism and totalitarianism, which is kind of fascinating because you would think that at least like in a totalitarian society, the one thing it answers is the problem of loneliness, right? You can join a mass movement, you can be part of a march, etc. But she defines totalitarianism as quote unquote organized loneliness, because you never feel more lonely than when you're surrounded by people requiring conformity of you. So I think good individualism, in the sense of like Cold War liberalism, is being able to differentiate yourself from the crowd. But that doesn't mean that you check out of society. I think that's a bastardization of the concept of the individual, that somehow like you're free on your boat and you don't have a care in the world. I mean, you're always going to be a social animal. It's just a question of how conformist are you. And unfortunately or fortunately, we do seem hardwired for conformity. So maybe not everybody is really as up to the individual task as is good for them. Arendt thought that most people could not participate in what she called an inner dialogue. And she saw that as the root of a lot of modern evil, that in a sense, because we couldn't be still with our own thoughts, as philosophers could be, we would fill our minds with all kinds of propaganda or talking points from the outside, and we'd basically just parrot whatever is going on around us.
And just kind of copy the crowd, and then perhaps kill the scapegoat, and these things keep going. What you just said reminded me of this really interesting question I had for you. Liberalism, this kind of Cold War liberalism we seem to be at the end of, or something like that. People seem to be fed up with it. They think it's not working at some level. Neoliberal is seen as this like a kind of a bad term to call someone. But what my big question is, what comes next? Do you have any visions of the future that are solid alternatives to liberalism that seem preferable and are actually achievable?
A lot of it has to do with how you define liberalism. I'm mostly of the view that a lot of people who are unhappy with liberalism are unhappy with one version of it, but they're not really unhappy with liberalism itself. Practically speaking, I think, in other words, practically speaking, liberalism has, on the whole, increased it's secured many basic civil rights. It's given us a lot of prosperity. Okay, sure, we're still unhappy because that's the human condition, and also liberalism is young. But even to be able to criticize liberalism on your Substack is a confirmation of liberalism. It's like a cheap shot of a point, right? But you're exercising your freedom of speech. So on a metaphysical level, I get why people would be unhappy with liberalism. I mean, one could have 1,000 objections. I think metaphysically it's rather thin. On what basis do you really justify it? I think the most compelling arguments for liberalism are instrumental. It's like, well, we live in a diverse society and we'd like to get along. Look at the history of Europe when we fought over religion. That wasn't so fun. So, when I hear people saying what comes after liberalism, we need to return to a theocracy, or if you will, it sort of is one proposal from the Christian post-liberals, or if it's like post-liberal from sort of more the economic left, in the form of like we need to be more aggressively redistributionist, or whatever it is. I think it behooves us to remember the origins of liberalism were technological. There was social technology for managing diversity. And all those proposals amount to, in my ears, is something to the effect of like liberalism doesn't deliver justice, it doesn't deliver truth. And I think a conscientious liberal would have to agree that that's true. But that's not the point of liberalism. Liberalism is kind of saying we would rather have peace or some relative peace than fighting in the streets. Can we be more aspirational? Can we reform certain things? Absolutely. That's what liberalism is all about. It's about making things better from within. The revolutionary mindset that opposes liberalism is just making it's basically just anti-status quoism. But I don't know how much of it is really based in deep thought versus just a personalized cost benefit analysis of like, is this good for me and mine or not? Fukuyama thought that liberalism decisively won the history of ideas, and that doesn't mean that every society will be liberal or that liberal societies, once they become liberal, will remain liberal. That's not really the point. The point is just that on the whole, liberal democracies have come into prominence, and that sort of secular trend indicates that it's likely to continue. It doesn't mean that in a particular case it's not fragile. And I kind of agree with Fukuyama. So for me personally, it's hard to imagine an alternative to liberalism taking off and becoming the new orthodoxy. But that doesn't mean you're not going to have various experiments, and we do experiments in post-liberalism. But to riff on Tyler Cowen on this point, like if you look at the revealed preferences of the global population, where are people moving?
Right.
And where are they leaving? They're moving to liberal societies, and they're leaving illiberal ones on the whole. So it's not to say some people in the Taliban would rather stay in Afghanistan. That's fine for them, but it's just to say on the whole, like the tide doesn't seem to be that. For all that people complain about America, they're not actually moving to Russia and Afghanistan.
Right. So perhaps the revealed preference is, liberalism, actually works, decently well. It's got holes, of course, but it's about as good as we can do as flawed people.
Liberalism is not equally good for everyone, for sure. So I think that the criticisms of liberalism are really, they're imported as psalms of lament, as voices of protest, and we should definitely open our hearts to those laments. But again, liberalism is kind of about what's good for the whole, and there's always going to be winners and losers in any political arrangement. That's what politics is. And I think probably certain Orthodox liberals are too dogmatic about the consensus that they think they have, when in fact we're much more diverse than we are. So that's what we're seeing now, is the internet and the decentralization of media giving people a voice who otherwise wouldn't be able to vocalize their protest. But those voices of protest have always been around.
It makes sense. It makes sense. It's something that just kind of continues. This question is related. It feels like we live in this world where there's just a ton of anxiety, depression. People don't feel very well at some level. Do you think we live at a time with an abnormal level of these things? And if so, is there anything we can do about it?
I don't have data to back me up on this, so anything I said should definitely be taken as just oracular rather than truthy. But I think we probably in the West have more anxiety and depression than I can't say than we did have in previous eras in the West, but I kind of feel like they are. I'm willing to hypothesize that they're first world problems. If you're starving, you can't really. You might be depressed about the fact that you're starving, but your survival instinct might also take over, such that you don't have the bandwidth to worry about what life is all about because you're too busy feeding yourself. So I mean, not that that's an antidote to depression. Don't try this at home.
Don't try, exactly.
But I think that certainly anxiety seems to be a first world problem born of in at least one instance, hyper competitive cultures. That would be one point. A second is just anxiety about the future, like which could correspond to actual deceleration and growth, or the fact that, or simply the fact that society is changing so quickly. It's hard really to plan. It's hard to be a definite optimist. If you grew up in a world where you can work one job for 50 years, okay, that has a certain unfreedom to it, but there's also a certain security to it. If you're like, the norm is that every couple years you're going to have to change jobs, so I think that would be anxiety inducing for sure. So I think some of it is social for sure, and some of it is an economic, and some of it is I think a symptom of a general malaise, a lostness about purpose. Because to go back to the dissatisfaction with liberalism, like capitalism gives people the ability to self-define what they're striving for, what they want to do with their money. But a lot of people, in my view and experience, don't actually know what it is that they ought to strive for. And so if money, which is a means to an end, becomes an end in itself, as Marx describes, mammon becomes God. I think that definitely will lead to tremendous depression and anxiety, which is why you see so many people of means quite depressed. Because if you don't know what you're trying to do with those means, well, then you're going to feel aimless.
You're a religious leader, and so I'm curious, how do you think about guiding people through these issues of, how to figure out what to shoot for, what is good, and what they should try to do with their lives? Because I'm assuming that has to come up, right? People coming to you with this question. I don't know.
I'm a very reluctant guide. I try really to customize my responses based upon what people are going through and mirror back to them the things they know, rather than sort of say, like, here's the menu, choose option A, B, or C. And in that sense, I'm a symptom of my time. Like, I do have some thoughts about like what a good life involves, but I just don't think it's effective to come top down and be like, this is what the Lord requires. I'm right. More into like the existentialist hero's journey as the method, and if the person's begging me to give them some thoughts on what to aim for, I'm happy to oblige, but I definitely don't want to start that way, if that makes any sense.
No, that makes sense, and trying to be effective is important in this case. Well, I'm curious, maybe it's difficult to give to those people, but like just in the theoretical, what do you think that looks like? What should we try to do? What should we try to shoot for?
Well, on a psychological level, I think that having a sense of gratitude is incredibly important. I mean, most of what I'm going to say is going to be super banal and the kinds of things that you can read in any self-help book, but like, the more that you can appreciate your life, the more that you can be present in the moment, things that mindfulness describes, not only will you feel better, but I think you will also perform better for others. Like you will uplift the environment, in my view. I certainly don't think it's enough to just feel grateful, and there are times when a situation calls not for gratitude, but for a negative emotion like anger or whatever. That being said, I think just having a much more of a baseline of tranquility and serenity, to the extent that that's in your control. Obviously, emotion is complicated. That's a good starting point. And traditional prayer is all about that. I begin my day every morning by saying, Modeh Ani, the Hebrew prayer for thank you, God, for giving me a soul, for allowing me to start this day with new life. So does it have to be framed theistically? No, it doesn't. But I think gratitude that you exist at all, awe and humility at the fact that you're here, that you have one life to live. It's just your life. What are you going to do with it? Make the most of it. How are you going to make the most of it today? Okay, you have a routine. You have a lot of things that you're required to do. Not all of it is fun. Can you make time for some moments in your day to remember that you have a soul? And I guess if you don't believe in a soul, that you have agency, if you will. I think maybe agency is a good secular word for soul. Something in you that's distinct. Something in you that if you did not do that, no one would. The one song that you can sing that no one else can sing. I think, in that sense, cultivating character is something that I feel is underrated in our society. We are so quick to point to what's wrong with the outside world, and why it's responsible for our problems. I'm not saying pick yourself up by the bootstraps. I'm not saying like gratitude solves any of these real problems. I just think that we definitely do have more agency at the margin than we think. So that's that's all I'm offering there. I think if you can cultivate, a handful of very meaningful relationships and invest deeply in them, that's certainly better than like being a social butterfly and just living your life as a so-called networker. Networking is fine. It's fun. It's good for it's good. But commitment is definitely underrated in our generation, both at the level of friendships, at the level of career, at the level of romance. Really at every level. So commit a little bit more. I'm not going to tell you what to commit to. I just think in general, commitment is good. I could go on and on, but trying to think what other general advice would I give? You have to have a full cup in order to be able to give. So figure out how to fill up your cup and then be generous. The goal is to get to a point where you are a giver rather than a taker. And it takes time to get there. And obviously we all have moments where we need to ask for help. It's not like you just accomplish you've finished. I don't need anything now. I can give, obviously. But I think moving from a taker mindset to a giver mindset is the highest way to be. And it's how many of the saints and the heroes in our imagination live. They lived for the sake of others. They to be to be cliched about it, the what do you call it? The the caricature of the venture capitalist with the Patagonia vest is their first words out of their mouth are, "How can I help? How can I be helpful?" I think if you can actually live that way genuinely, that is a tremendous way to live. That will not only bring you meaning, but bring others meaning. And obviously, if you have a sense of a higher consciousness, be it God or whatever, that does help with that, because then in every moment that you're here to serve the Creator. But even without that, I think so much of the form of religion can still translate in a secular context.
Makes sense, mate. There's a lot of good advice there. You did mention one thing, which I think is actually under discussed, but I think super, super useful. It's try and do something along the lines of, you'll have to correct me, something along the lines of that you should try to do something that if you don't do it, it won't happen. Try and do something unique. Do you think that's important? And I found in my life that that's where I get a lot of meaning, is when I do something that meets that criteria, right? It's not like I'm just doing something replaceable, something competitive where someone could come in and do, essentially the same job, maybe slightly worse, but it would still happen anyway.
It's a tremendous privilege and blessing to be able to self-express. And not everyone gets to do it for work, but whether you can do it for work or not, you can definitely carve out some time in your day or your week to do it, and you should. You should know yourself, as Socrates tells us. And you can't really know yourself just by looking in the mirror or meditating. In my view, you have to know yourself by taking action and experimenting and getting feedback from the world. And that could come in the form of producing art. It could come in the form of starting a company. It could really taking any chance, putting yourself out there, taking more risk, exposing yourself to serendipity. It's so good. It's so nourishing. It's scary for sure, but yeah, I don't think everybody is cut out to do this all the time. We all have kind of different risk tolerances, and some of us are just kind of happier when we're out putting ourselves out there, and some of us are a little more shy, or maybe more analytical, and so we want to know how things work rather than sort of this potentially egomaniacal view that I'm offering, which is like, well, what do I have to say? It's like, no, I'm happy just to be a helper. That's fine. I'm not saying my personality type is the best. I just think that within any personality type, there's probably definitely room for doing something singular. And in a Jewish context, I'd say like God created human beings in the divine image, the biblical context, in Genesis. And much ink has been spilled on what that even means, that we're created in the divine image. Personally, I think it means that God is a creator, and so the human being is created to be a creator. God did something that nobody else did or could do, and God created one being that also has that ability and that obligation, that responsibility to do something that none other can do.
I love that. That's really good. That's just it's a really good a framing of of people, and just think about this, the singularity of the individual, right? Like each person is truly someone singular and special, and that's something that comes up a lot in the rationalist community that I like to think about is like, well, I think something that's underaddressed is just how each person is totally unique and special, and how we should lift that up in some extent, and just the specialness of people, and how do we cultivate each individual? It seems like an important thing to strive to do.
What do you think the rationalist community's take on that issue is? Why is it sort of underdeveloped in your view?
It's super interesting. I think it comes from, have you read much about effective altruism, like utilitarianism? Yeah.
Sure.
I think that can, unintentionally sometimes smash down the individual into, everybody. It's just like, we're all just bundles of utility, and how do we maximize that? And, I think the effective altruism movement is very important in the sense that you should try to do charity that is more effective, like on the margin. Like if we can do one thing that serves 22 people and one that can do 20, and everything's equal, of course we should do the one that helps more people. But I think when you start trying to calculate things out to a more granular level than that, you run into a lot of problems, and it feels like a lot of the bad things in the 20th century, came from these things where you just smash the individual down, and, fascism and communism, and just these kind of totalizing, sense of community where we're all going to just get jammed together and everyone's the same. I don't know. I don't have well-developed thoughts on that, but that's generally what I think.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a tension that any political philosopher is going to face, because between the system and the individual. Because if you just focus on the individual, you can have a lot of inefficiency and a lack of accountability. You potentially end up celebrating some individuals more than others. And so I definitely see utilitarianism and other philosophical movements as a rebellion against that, as sort of an attempt to say we're all the same, because they don't like the idea of like, why should this person get all the glory and everybody else be serfs, right?
Absolutely. It's a real tension. I'm curious your take on this, and I don't have fully formed thought on this question, but I think it could be interesting. Generally, what is your take on hierarchy? What is the kind of what's your reading of the Jewish take on hierarchy? We live in an age that seems to really, it's weird. In some ways praise hierarchy, in some ways be very against any kind of hierarchy in the world. It's this weird like tension, which I can't quite get a grip on. So it's kind of a vague question, but I don't know if you have any thoughts there.
I do have a lot of thoughts on it. I think hierarchy is inevitable, and I guess to the extent that it's inevitable, it's a kind of law of both nature and human organization. It's good, or at minimum, it's neutral. You can have terrible hierarchies, you can have abuse and corruption within hierarchies, but that critique is more about who ought to be in power
Right.
rather than it is about process. Or no, actually, you can even have hierarchies that have good or bad processes. So I think hierarchy as a term needs to be disambiguated. But let's just go back to the Bible for a second. Like, one of the core stories of the Hebrew Bible is the liberation of the Israelite slaves from Egypt. Now, it's bad that one people is enslaving another. That is clearly terrible. In my view, the Bible connects that political reality, that social reality, to a theological reality. That theological reality is that all of the Egyptians worship their leader as God. So it follows from that, it follows from the despotism of Pharaoh, that you're going to have a society arranged in a dehumanizing way. If the point of monotheism, if the point of the Bible is that only God is God, no human being can claim to be God, there is a fundamental egalitarianism in that, fundamental resistance to despotism in that. But that doesn't mean that when the Israelites leave Egypt, that they have a flat organization and everybody has equal share in the decision-making process. There's still a prophet, Moses, who top-down gives orders, and there's a court system with higher and lower court and so on and so forth. And of course, at the top of that hierarchy is God. So at least in a biblical context, it's not that we're anti-hierarchy, it's that there's good and bad hierarchies. Here's the rub. If everybody is created in the divine image, then certain rights and certain obligations follow from that insight. And those are radical. We can reasonably disagree about what those are. But from that point of view, there is no hierarchy. No one person can claim to be better than another person. No one race can claim to be better than another race. God created all human beings as individuals equal to one another in dignity, if you will, in soulfulness. Plato, on the face of it, does not share this view. He thinks there are golden souls, silver souls, copper souls, bronze souls. The Israelite people are chosen for a specific mission. There is certainly within Jewish theology a tendency to supremacism, or what do you call it, chauvinism, to say, the Jews are a better people than other peoples. But even within that view, I think it's not really a hierarchical view based in essence. It's a view based in being chosen for something as opposed to being born this way. So even that is kind of radical, that what would make you better than someone, if you will, if you want to put it in that unpolitically correct way, is what you do, not what you're born into.
That makes sense.
And you can't inherit greatness. You have to become great. A person, the child of a hero, can squander that lineage, and a nobody can rise in status. I think that follows from the idea of the individual being created in the divine image, as opposed to a caste system where you say, well, this priestly class are the descendants of the gods, and these lower classes descend from Drek.
Right.
So I'm absolutely against metaphysical hierarchy when it comes to comparing human beings to one another. And I think a lot of evil does, and megalomania does, come from the temptation to say, like, this person is a better person than that person at the level of essence. But obviously, some people do good things, great things, and some people don't. And we should absolutely esteem and value those who exercise all kinds of heroism, including moral heroism, over those who squander it. Certainly, we need to take into account that everybody has unique trials and tribulations, and so it's always apples to oranges when you're comparing people. But I definitely am against the idea that we shouldn't have competition or we shouldn't afford unequal outcomes, to people who get the glory versus people who get less glory. It's just the theological point about everyone being created in the divine image is that we're not attaching people's ultimate worth to any of that. The fact that somebody can run the fastest mile in the universe doesn't make them like inherently better than the person who walks it in the slowest,
right,
in the slowest way. And I think too often the both extremes are wrong in the hierarchy debate. Like the ones who are like, yeah, you won, amazing, that's what it's all about. No, what it's all about is using your talent to serve, not about like gloating about how great you are. That's Pharaohism. But just because you're a loser in a particular race, doesn't mean you have to be a sore loser. Connect to your own uniqueness, connect to your own glory, find a different race to run, and then it won't bother you as much that you got bested.
It makes a lot of sense, and I'm always reminded. I've been reading this biography of Julius Caesar, and he walks by a statue of Alexander the Great, and he's just like really torn up by the fact that he's like 30 and he's not done anything near as great as Alexander had done by the time he was 30. And so in some sense these things just must never end, right? It doesn't matter how good you are. There's always going to be someone who's slightly better or done something better than you, and so you should go back to kind of your individual glory.
I think at the level of character, one should be in competition with oneself. That sort of connects back to what advice would I give is like, ignore the praise and ignore the blame. Or don't let the praise and the blame get to you too much. Obviously it does. It forms you. But get to a point where you're not reliant upon it.
Just use it.
If a person says, wow, that's so smart, maybe it is so smart relative to them, but relative to where you ought to be, it's actually not very smart. So not all praise is equal.
Right. Exactly. I love that. That's really good. Well, Zohar, that just spurred a question in my mind, and it's a very large question, and we're on like a 1 hour podcast, so it may not be possible to really answer this at all, but maybe you've thought about it. Do you have a sense on what we're here to do? As individuals, as a community, it could be any of these. But yeah, and that's a very, very large question, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on it.
If you take sort of a macro view of this individual question, we all have a lot in common with one another by virtue of being born in the 20th century. In a sense, if you think of time or era as a kind of country, we are all nationals
right.
of modernity. Modernity is a country, or post-modernity. And I think that what we're here to do has something to do with that, because one of the slogans of modernity from Ezra Pound is "Make it new." There's really an emphasis, I think, on invention and innovation in modernity, and corollary to that, in postmodernity, there's a sense of despair as to whether we can make anything new anymore. That's the decadence thesis of Ross Douthat and to some extent Tyler Cowen's Great Stagnation thesis. The sense of like, well, all the greatness is behind us. Now what can we do? What are we here to do? I think we are here to reckon with the fact that we are modern or postmodern, and that we have more opportunities and more challenges than our ancient forebears. So we should, I'm not going to say we should strive for progress, but I think we should strive to appreciate, this is how I put it theologically, we should strive to appreciate, why did God put us in this historical moment and not in a previous one. You know, God gave us good dental care and Uber Eats so that we could use it for something.
Right.
I'm sorry if that sounded glib.
No, that's good. I
You
like
know,
it.
you and I are having a much higher quality of life than a king in Europe who lived in the 16th century. So what will we do with that? And at the same time, like there's more, you know, mass death than ever. There's more complex ways that power can be wielded to oppress. So what are we doing about that? So I think it's sort of the perennial questions resurface, and then they have a unique tint colored by history and culture. And then that's the paradox, is sort of how does the historical and the eternal interrelate? But that's what I would say we're here to figure out, or to be Desjardins, I think Teilhard de Chardin, he said we're not human beings on a spiritual journey, we're spiritual beings on a human journey. So I would riff on that and say, like, we are eternal beings on a historical journey.
I like that. I like that. I think that's really good. I really like that. I'm curious. You know, I've asked a couple people this, and I'd love to get your take. And you just brought this up. You know, to you, what's the distinction between, you know, the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern? Does it have to do with newness? Is it something else?
Pre-modern, modern, and postmodern.
Yeah,
I think you can tell the story at the level of technology, at the level of culture, or at the level of ideas, and they all interrelate for sure. I think the pre-modern, in one telling, there's basically just before the Industrial Revolution and after the Industrial
right.
Revolution. That's like kind of the easiest way to do it. Because for the average person doesn't really care if Galileo or Newton have a new view of the universe. Like,
right.
That's just fake news, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
They're not listening.
Doesn't matter. Doesn't know anything.
So, but obviously, the consequences of the scientific revolution are profound, not just for scientists but for everyone. So I think that maybe I describe the pre-modern era as one in which there's a certain order and naive elegance to the world. The modern is sort of one of inverting that. In particular, I think of Nietzsche as anti-metaphysical, as Nietzsche is sort of saying it's all perspective. And in a sense, and modernity really throwing everything on its head, right? You take Marx as another example. Marx takes the concept of God and says it's just a projection of society. It's just to cope. You have basically Freud doing that with every myth that the individual tells itself. That's just your Oedipus complex or whatever it is. So I think, you know, moderns kind of they reject, they invert, they rebel in the name of doing something new. The French revolutionaries, as Walter Benjamin describes them, were shooting at the clock towers because they sought revenge not just against the regime, the political regime, but against time itself, against the way that time was organized, the mechanical clock.
That's awesome.
I think postmodernity is, in a sense, a scaling back of that hubris, a realization that, in fact, we can't achieve as much as we think when we just invert and rebel, and subvert and transgress, that we end up being just as dogmatic and limited also as that which we're rejecting. I think postmodernism is less certain of itself than modernism or modernity is just like, yeah, we've got the truth. This was bad. We have the truth. And postmodernity is more like
we don't know.
We don't know. It's complicated. So, and it's also a bit of a mixing and a matching. You know, take some things from here, take some things from there. I think you had that in modernity too. Modernity, as modern aesthetics, were all about pastiche. T.S. Eliot, you know, is a good example of that. The Wasteland is like a poem composed of like lots of random quotations, mixing like things he heard on the streets with Dante. But I think postmodernity takes it to like a wild extreme, because in modernity, there's still kind of a canon that you're grappling with. And it's sort of this imposing, like, sort of authoritarian father figure. And postmodernity it's sort of both indifferent and liberated from that, indifferent to and liberated from that gravitas. It's more like nothing means anything anymore. So you just sort of do your own aesthetic. I think that's kind of how I describe postmodernity aesthetically. But I think that just generally maybe modernism was skeptical of centralized power. Like, it was skeptical of the king, but it wasn't skeptical of power. And postmodernity is just skeptical. And
just generally skeptical.
That general skepticism, in my view, can lead to some interesting counterintuitive places, because skepticism is always a double-edged sword. It can weirdly lead to a doubling down on or a return to pre-modernity. So, for instance, if you say that like we can't know anything, one response to that conundrum is to say, well, we might as well just go with this since you can't disprove it. So like Bertrand Russell, who's more a modernist, is going to be like, look at these believers. They're so ridiculous. You know, I could just as well believe in like tiny teapots orbiting the earth as I could believe in a god. And postmodernisms are like, yeah, but since it's all absurd, you might as well go to mass.
Right.
You know what I mean? So they're not going to argue that you ought to go to mass from first principles, but they'll sort of argue for it from the fact that you can never prove that they're wrong.
That's good. That's good. And a weird place to find ourselves, I must say.
Yeah, I think postmodernity, right? There was a guy, Bruno Latour. He wrote a book called "We Have Never Been Modern." He was like a big environmentalist, but his theories are quite postmodern. And so there was a New York Times article about him some years ago, as he sort of realized that his own skepticism about science was being used by climate change deniers. And he was sort of both horrified and, as I recall, like, yeah, I guess I did allow for this. So I think that's postmodernity, is just living in a place of a complete disalignment of narratives, where no single organization can claim that it has the answers. Whereas modernity was like, this is canceled, but we have the new dogma, we have the new orthodoxy. And now postmodern is like, everyone's canceled, at least when it isn't my team, but then somebody else just cancels them. So
yep. That's the way that goes. Well, speaking of canceling, I don't want to get in the weeds of this, but with the current, do you see the current culture war kind of subsiding, like going back? We've got polarization that's at the level that was, pre-Civil War. So it's pretty high, like really high. It has been higher before, but it's quite high. Do you think this is like just downstream of like slower growth or something like that, and it's just kind of a mechanical problem? Or is it like something in the water, people just, they want to have something to fight over? Do you have any like meta level thoughts about that?
Yeah, I don't know if we're more polarized than it's hard to here. I do have thoughts. I think a lot of it has to do with media. In general, I think like Facebook poisoned our minds. I don't mean in the normal way that people talk about it in terms of misinformation. I just mean there's something really bad for people who spend like hours of their day scrolling through social media and posting like whatever their hottest take is on anything, and getting into stupid fights with like people that they, with strangers, but even more just disheartening with friends and teachers and family members publicly. It's like utterly disgraceful. So I think that as much as social media has done a lot of positives, and I'm full disclosure, I enjoy using Twitter quite a bit, but I did delete my Facebook some years ago. I think that media has empowered our worst habits in a click, and that there's like sort of a new norm that a lot of people have to engage with everything all the time, and there's a never-ending source of things to generate outrage. And so it's not that people weren't divided on hot button issues in every generation. It's just that now the thing that you first think about when you see that person at a party is what they posted, instead of like meeting them with genuine curiosity and getting to know a side of them that would lead to connectivity and empathy. You're automatically putting them in some kind of box as to what, what their values are. In a sense, we've all become walking algorithms. I think that's terrible.
It's just super legible. Like you just know, like, and that's all you identify with because it's very, very vivid. It's super compelling. You know what I mean? Like Zohar believes X. And this is all I can think about.
I mean, there's sort of much ado is made about identity politics, but less ado is made of what I would call politics as identity. And I think that's in a sense the root of identity politics is forget the group we're talking about, just the general cultural trend to identify as having certain views on politics being the primary way that you want people to interact with you or that you interact with other people. And it's hard to know if that's because what's causing that, but I wonder if that's been the case before. I think in religion, I do see that a tide changing. I think a generation earlier, people what they might have had in common was living in the same neighborhood, coming together for happy times and sad times. And now what they have in common is whatever activist thing that they care about on either side of the aisle. And if you don't share that, then you're not welcome in the community. Like you sort of, and what's strange is like, so in liberal religion, it's sort of, the activism is, it replaces the traditional creed. But in more orthodox, or I guess, pre-liberal religion, if you will, you have the same phenomenon. Like you would think that that more culturally conservative religious people, in my estimation, would be focused on religion rather than politics. But in fact, I think everybody has been captured by the politicization of religion. And so that does beg the question of, well, what is religion? What is its relationship to politics? I don't want to like create too simplistic a picture, as if religion and politics have nothing to do with one another. But like, to put it very bluntly, we're all Spinozists now, because Spinoza defined religion as downstream of society. He basically says, religion is just a tool for getting people to organize, and it has no inherent truth to it. It's just the laws are just there to bind you to one another. And I kind of feel like everybody has accepted that on some level. And
like it's just a community.
For me, that's sad. For me, that's sad. I'm not saying we should strive for apolitical spirituality, but I think we've definitely tilted too much towards the political in a society that's already doing that. So like if religion's supposed to be countercultural or interesting, what is it doing that you can't just get from being on Facebook if it's basically just another venue for politicization? So that would be my critique.
Absolutely. No, and I have the strong belief, it should be above politics, right? I mean, it's some very basic level, but instead it's just like gets all intertwined with it now. And, perhaps that's just revealed preference of what people want nowadays, but it's not very good. It seems like.
I don't think it's above politics, but I don't think that, it's reducible to politics. Politics is inescapable. We're political animals, as Aristotle says, and people are going to be happy or unhappy in any given room with who's holding the power. So like that's not going away. But I think if prayer, for instance, is about connecting to higher consciousness, that's very different than like prayer as a script for simply stating what you care about. And I don't. I think maybe we've humanized religion too much. We've sanitized it too much, and it's become only about human values. When in fact, if the point of religion is to get us to see beyond the limitations of the short time horizon and prejudices of our given cultural moment, then we need to bring that sense of mystery and awe back. I don't associate mystery and awe with activism personally. Some might pull it off. Dr. King pulled it off, but on the whole, I don't. I think of activism mostly as imbued with a sense of certainty and confidence, and there's a time for that. But religion can't just be about that.
Definitely. I think that's really well put. Well, with the last couple of minutes, I'd love to run through a quick round of overrated or underrated. You down?
Sure.
All right. So I'll throw out a term. Just tell me whether or not it's overrated or underrated. Maybe a sentence or two why. Overrated or underrated? Hegel.
I think Hegel is underrated because he writes pretty badly.
Yeah.
But he's sort of overrated in the sense that a lot of his ideas are already mainstream, even if people aren't reading him. The one thing from Hegel that I really do think is underrated is the master-slave struggle, the struggle for recognition. It just never gets old. It's the fundamental point of it is just how being the underdog is the source of creativity and ambition and moves history along, and being the one who's achieved the high status is actually a kind of complacency or death. So I think that is a really fascinating angle on both history and also on personal psychology.
It's good. Rawls, overrated or underrated?
I think he's probably overrated by most people who know who he is.
Right.
As to why that is the case. I mean, Rawls was a systematic thinker, one of the last, but his ideas haven't really scaled beyond a very small segment of elites. And so I think if for Rawls's project to succeed, he would have to be more persuasive beyond that segment.
Makes sense. One last one. It's and I might mispronounce her name. Is it Gillian Rose?
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Yeah.
Is Gillian Rose overrated or underrated? She's underrated primarily because she's not known or read. I also think she's great thinkers transcend whatever views they might have taken on a particular issue. Like Heidegger, for instance, was a right winger, but somebody who's had tremendous influence on the left. And that's a testament. I mean, Hegel would be another example of somebody who's influenced basically everyone across the aisle. I think that Rose is underread for a lot of reasons, but even though she's working on Adorno primarily, she's not just an Adorno scholar, she's an original thinker. And I think as such, like people, regardless of their views on politics, would benefit a lot from thinking with her. In particular, in her book, Morning Becomes the Law, she describes the project of being postmodern as taking the she says that her project is to try to recover truth after it's been destroyed by the Holocaust and by postmodernity. I think that's just a very compelling idea. And it's not nostalgic. She's not saying we need to go back to an earlier time. Instead, what she offers this through the lens of this motif of mourning is she used the myth of Phocion, who was exiled from the polis, from the city. His wife, after Phocion died, ate his ashes and then walked back into the city and brought his presence back into the city by swallowing his ashes. So she used that as a core metaphor for the philosopher's project to sign of, in a sense, swallow the ashes of reason that came from reason being canceled after people were so disappointed with the 20th century. I find that very meaningful. It's
That's
kind
really
of
good.
it's harrowing, but I think it's a poetic image, and it's also, we need more thinkers who think creatively about how to balance head and heart, and she's definitely someone who does that.
That's really good. That's really good. Well, Zohar, thank you so much for taking the time to come on today. I really appreciated the conversation. Where can people find your work? Where should we send them?
Thank you, Will. This is great. So I have a podcast called Meditations with Zohar. You can find it in all the places.
Highly recommended.
Thank you. And I write 2 Substacks. One is a philosophy newsletter. It's called What is Called Thinking, whatiscalledthinking.substack.com. And I do a Bible commentary every week, also at Substack. It's a little harder to spell, but etzasadeh, .substack.com. And you can just you can find all of that information on my personal website, zoharatkins.com, or just find me on Twitter, where I'm active, and say hello. Zohar Atkins is my handle.
Perfect. We'll put the links down there in the show notes. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much. This was great.
Thank you. Special thanks to our sponsor, Bismarck Analysis, for the support. Bismarck Analysis creates the Bismarck Brief, a newsletter about intelligence-grade analysis of key industries, organizations, and live players. You can subscribe to Bismarck Brief at brief.bismarckanalysis.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Narratives. Special thanks to Donovan Dorrance, our audio editor. You can check out Donovan's work and music at donovandorrance.com.